Few stories in rock history carry the emotional weight of what unfolded between Paul McCartney and George Harrison. They began as two boys from the working-class streets of Liverpool, bound together by a shared obsession with music. But as fame arrived on an almost supernatural scale, their friendship twisted into something far more complicated. A bond threaded with loyalty, silent resentment, creative rivalry, and, ultimately, a love that neither man found easy to express out loud. The story starts long before stadiums and screaming fans. Paul McCartney and George Harrison first crossed paths in 1954 at the Liverpool Institute High School for Boys. Paul, 1 year older, had already established himself as sharp-witted and musically curious. George, quieter and more introverted, struggled in the rigid school environment, finding little inspiration in classrooms or textbooks. What connected them was something far simpler and far more powerful: music. Their friendship deepened during long bus rides across the city, where Paul would bring out his guitar and the two boys would fall into conversation that stretched for hours. They bonded over the skiffle craze sweeping through Britain at the time, a style borrowed from American folk and jazz that made music feel accessible to young hands and restless minds. Both were captivated by American rock and roll, by Elvis Presley's swagger, Buddy Holly's melodic clarity, and Little Richard's volcanic energy. George was particularly struck by Heartbreak Hotel, a song that seemed to reach through the radio and grab him by the collar. He began sketching guitars in his school notebooks and practiced until his fingertips ached. Paul had grown up around music too. His father Jim played in a jazz band, and Paul had learned piano early before picking up the guitar. When he looked at George, he saw not just enthusiasm but commitment, the kind of dedication that separates those who dream about music from those who actually make it. By 1957, Paul had joined John Lennon's skiffle group The Quarrymen, and it wasn't long before he began pushing for George to join as well. John was skeptical. George was barely a teenager and, in John's blunt assessment, looked far too young. But George settled the debate on a Liverpool bus, where he played the rockabilly instrumental Raunchy, with enough precision and feel to silence every doubt. He was in. The essential core of what would become the Beatles was now complete. Those early years were everything. The three of them spent countless hours playing together, sharing ideas, learning from each other, and dreaming about a life beyond Liverpool. For Paul, who had lost his mother at 14, this brotherhood was more than musical companionship. It was a lifeline. For George, it was recognition, a place where his talent was not just noticed but valued. Success changed everything, as it always does. By the mid-1960s, the Beatles had become the most famous band in the world, and Paul McCartney had naturally grown into the role of creative driving force. His perfectionism and boundless work ethic shaped the band's sound and direction in ways that were undeniable, but also increasingly suffocating for George. The Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership was a locked room that George could rarely enter. His own compositions, carefully written, emotionally rich, spiritually searching, were consistently pushed aside or allocated only the smallest space on albums dominated by Paul and John's output. George was evolving rapidly as a songwriter, but the band's internal hierarchy moved slowly, if at all. The frustration built quietly, like pressure behind a sealed door. The 1967 album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band became a symbol of that imbalance. The album was widely understood as Paul's artistic vision, a bold conceptual leap that pushed rock music into entirely new territory. George's contribution, Within You Without You, was a deeply personal meditation shaped by his immersion in Indian music and Hindu philosophy. To Paul and the others, it was one track among many. To George, it was a statement of who he was becoming, and who he was determined to be. Their 1968 trip to India, where the band studied transcendental meditation with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, exposed the growing gulf between them. George embraced the experience with complete sincerity, finding in it a spiritual foundation that would guide the rest of his life. Paul engaged more casually, treating the journey more like a creative retreat than a transformative pilgrimage. At one point Paul attempted to lighten the mood with a joking comment, "Calm down, Georgie boy," and the words landed badly. For George, this was no joke. His spiritual path was the most serious thing in his life. By 1969, the pressure had become unbearable. The recording sessions for what would become the Let It Be album were captured on film, and the footage revealed a band coming apart at the seams. Paul's tendency to take charge, to direct others and impose his vision on arrangements and performances, had long frustrated George. But now there was no diplomatic veneer left. The moment came plainly and painfully. George looked at Paul and said, quietly but with devastating clarity, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if you don't want me to." Whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it. It was not a threat. It was surrender, and that made it worse. Behind those words were years of compositions that had been dismissed, years of creative contributions treated as secondary, years of a younger brother trying to be heard in a room that never quite fell silent long enough to listen. On January 10, 1969, George Harrison walked out. He described the environment as very unhealthy and unhappy, and he stayed away for 12 days. The band scrambled. George was their lead guitarist, yes, but more than that, his absence forced everyone to acknowledge something they had all been avoiding. The Beatles were no longer a brotherhood. They were four individuals pulling in different directions, held together by contract, history, and habit. George returned, but the wounds didn't heal. He had written Woa on the day he left, a raw, driving expression of the frustration Paul's dominance had created in him. His stockpile of songs that the band had rejected, including All Things Must Pass, Isn't It a Pity, and Run of the Mill, waited quietly for their moment. That moment came in 1970, when the Beatles officially disbanded and George released his landmark triple album All Things Must Pass. It was a creative explosion, decades of held-back expression finally unleashed. The song Run of the Mill carried lines that seemed aimed directly at Paul. You've got me wondering how I lost your friendship. Music, as always, said what conversation couldn't. Before the end came one final flourish of brilliance. The 1969 sessions for Abbey Road produced two of the most celebrated songs in the Beatles' entire catalog, and both were written by George Harrison. Here Comes the Sun captured something luminous and effortless. Something stopped listeners cold with its emotional directness. Frank Sinatra later called it the greatest love song ever written. John Lennon said it was the best track on the album. For George, these weren't just compliments. They were confirmation that he had never been what others assumed. A supporting player, a lucky member of someone else's band. He was an artist of the first order. Paul recognized it too, though acknowledgement didn't come easily or cleanly. He later admitted publicly that he had underestimated George during the Beatles' years, calling him a late bloomer who had ultimately written some of the most exceptional songs of their time. George's response was characteristically sharp. He reminded people that he had been writing those songs for years. He hadn't bloomed late. He had simply been kept from the light. The 1970s were marked by sporadic and often frosty contact. George pursued his spiritual life and solo career with intensity, while Paul built wings and chased commercial success with characteristic determination. George gave interviews in which he said plainly that he could imagine playing with John Lennon again but not with Paul. Paul heard these comments, and though he handled them with composure in public, privately the words cut deep. In 1971, George organized the concert for Bangladesh, one of the first major humanitarian benefit concerts in history. He invited Paul. Paul declined, citing logistical complications. The gap between them widened. The thaw came slowly. By the early 1990s, both men had lived enough life to understand that old grievances, however real, were not worth carrying forever. In February 1994, Paul, George, and Ringo Starr gathered at Paul's studio to work on unfinished John Lennon demo recordings, a project that gave fans brief, dizzying hope that something like the Beatles could exist again. George arrived with clear conditions. He insisted on bringing his friend Jeff Lynne as producer, warning Paul that without a guiding hand, the sessions could turn dangerous. "You've got egos flying around," George said plainly. He wasn't wrong, and Paul knew it. They disagreed throughout, on arrangements, on sounds, on the direction of the songs, but they finished the work. Free as a Bird and Real Love emerged from those sessions, imperfect but genuine, a bridge between what once was and what remained. In 1997, George was diagnosed with throat cancer. Lung cancer and a brain tumor followed. Then, in 1999, he survived a brutal knife attack at his home by an intruder, an incident that shook everyone who cared about him. His body weakened, but his spiritual core held steady. Paul visited when he could. The old tensions began to dissolve in the quiet of hospital rooms and home visits. These were not the grand reconciliations of films or fairy tales. They were smaller, more human than that. Two old friends sitting together, joking about nothing important, remembering things that only they remembered. At one point they held hands. For two men who had spent decades in conflict, who had grown up in an era and a culture where such gestures were unthinkable, the moment meant everything. George Harrison died on November 29, 2001. He was 58 years old. His ashes were scattered in the Ganges and Yamuna rivers, in accordance with his deep devotion to Hindu spirituality. He left behind music that continues to move people, Not just the Beatles recordings, but the vast solo catalog of a man who spent his life searching for something true. Paul has spoken about George with increasing openness in the years since. He has described whispering greetings to a tree George planted near his home. He has nurtured the friendship between their children. He has said, simply and without performance, that George was one of the great loves of his life. Their story is not a tidy one. It doesn't end with every wound healed or every argument resolved. What it offers instead is something more honest. The portrait of two people who loved each other, competed fiercely with each other, hurt each other, and in the end found their way back. Not perfectly and not without loss, but back. That, perhaps, is what real friendship looks like when it survives long enough to be tested.